Frank stood at the edge of the yard, his boots sunken into wet spring soil, staring at the spot where roses once bloomed beside Grandma Lily's sundial. It was bare now, raised by order of the HOA. The soil was still soft from last night's rain, clinging to his soles like a silent witness. The sundial, an aged bronze piece with faintly etched Roman numerals, sat exposed and alone, no longer cradled by the soft blush of Lily's peace roses. For over 3 decades, that garden had marked the heart of their home, an act of love more than horticulture. Now it looked surgical, erased. Not a root in sight. He knelt and let his hand skim the damp dirt, more gesture than intent. Then, quietly, he pulled the notice from his coat pocket again. It had been taped to the door in bold type, complete with HOA letterhead, dry legal language, and Marlene Wexler's efficient, slanted signature. Landscape nonconformity. Immediate removal required. Frank folded it back along its original creases. He knew every word by now. He sighed and straightened, his knees protesting. From a curtained window across the street, a neighbor's silhouette flinched as he glanced their way. Frank didn't wave. Back inside, the house was still, too still. He wandered past Lily's old armchair, a knitted throw still draped over the arm. The air carried a faint hint of lavender oil and coffee grounds. He opened the hall closet and reached into the top shelf where the tin box had waited since the funeral. The label, yellowed with time, read Spring Mix, 1998. He turned it over in his hands. It was sealed, the way she'd left it. His fingers paused at the lid's rim, then gently set it on the kitchen table without opening it. At noon, Frank drove to the Willowbend Diner, his usual corner booth still empty. The bell above the door chimed, and June, the middle-aged waitress with gentle eyes and an embroidered apron, looked up from her notepad. "Black coffee, Frank?" she asked, already pouring. He nodded. "Thanks, June." Emily arrived 5 minutes later, wind-chapped and clutching a canvas tote. She slid into the seat across from him and gave his hand a light pat. "I saw the garden," she said softly. "It looks..." He stared out the window. "Empty. They can't just tear it out like that. There's got to be something you can do. They sent 3 notices." "Lily didn't want to change it," Frank replied. Emily's mouth tightened. "Then let's talk to someone. Legal aid, city council." He cut her off, voice steady. "Lily hated courts. She always said, let weeds die on their own. Don't waste time yanking them up by the root." June returned with 2 plates of corned beef hash and toast. "On the house," she said quietly, sensing the mood. Later that evening, the air had cooled to the edge of frost. Frank stood in the garage under the dull bulb, surrounded by the tools of a career long retired. He rummaged through a shelf until he found a trowel with a splintered handle. It was Lily's. He dusted it off. Back at the kitchen table, he unsealed the tin box. Inside were dozens of small, yellow envelopes, each labeled in Lily's handwriting: Alyssum, Pansy, Marigold. Peace Rose. He lifted the rose envelope with a breath held in memory. Just one bulb rested inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper. It smelled faintly of soil and something sweeter. With quiet care, he stepped outside under the porch light, crossed the narrow walkway, and knelt beside the curb, just beyond the HOA's official maintenance boundary. His hands moved slowly but confidently, digging into the grass. He placed the bulb inside and covered it, pressing down gently. A school bus had passed earlier, and now the street was mostly still. Frank stood there a moment longer, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on his knee. From up the block came the shuffle of small shoes on pavement. A child, no more than 8, wearing a red backpack and a too-large jacket, ambled down the sidewalk. He stopped and pointed at the freshly turned soil. "Is that a flower?" A week later, the bulb had sprouted, and so had a warning sign from the HOA, hammered into the curb: unauthorized planting subject to fine. Frank read it twice, then once more for good measure. The wooden stake leaned slightly, as if the ground itself rejected its message. The little shoot beside it stood fragile but firm, 2 leaves unfurling against the spring breeze. He adjusted his cap and muttered something under his breath that Lily would have found uncharitable. Emily arrived mid-morning with groceries and a raised eyebrow. "Subtle," she said, eyeing the sign. Frank didn't look up. "They used a roofing nail. Amateur job." "You always said Mom was the stubborn one," she quipped. "Guess she got it from Lily," he replied, with a flicker of something like pride. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon. Emily started putting away items while Frank opened a thick envelope stamped HOA Willowbend Association. A fine, typed in bold near the bottom, $75 for unauthorized planting in community easement. Attached was a grainy photo of the tiny bulb, next to the sign. Later that evening, Frank smoothed out his shirt collar in the mirror. "You're really going?" Emily asked from the hallway. "If they're going to fine me, they can say it to my face." Willowbend Community Hall had once been a dance pavilion, or so Lily used to say. Now it smelled of floor polish and recycled paper. Folding chairs faced a low platform where the HOA board sat. Marlene Wexler, perched behind a small podium, gavelled the meeting to order with sharp precision. Frank took a seat near the back. A few neighbors nodded cautiously, others avoided his gaze altogether. "First item," Marlene began, "budget allocations for Q2 landscaping improvements." Beside her, Mr. Elwood Barnes cleared his throat and read aloud from a printed spreadsheet. He wore a beige cardigan and rimless glasses, voice even, avoiding any eye contact with Frank as he spoke of mulch costs and sprinkler repairs. When Frank stood to speak, Marlene's gavel came down again. "Comments are limited to agenda items, Mr. Hastings. I'd like to ask why a flower growing outside HOA property warrants a fine," Frank said evenly. "It's still under visual jurisdiction," she replied. "Standards must be consistent for community value." Someone near the front shifted uncomfortably. Barnes's hand trembled slightly as he turned the next page. Frank waited, but no one else spoke. He sat down. After the meeting, he lingered outside. The night air was laced with the scent of early dogwoods. As the hall emptied, a familiar voice called softly, "Frank?" He turned. Millie, the widow from 2 houses down, stepped out of the shadowed entryway. Her coat was too big and her voice was barely above a whisper. "They tore up my lavender bed too," she said. "Back in 19. I didn't even fight. Just let it go." "I remember," he replied, surprised. "It used to smell like Provence in the evening." Her eyes misted. "They said it was a trip hazard." She gave a short, bitter laugh. It was 3 inches tall. That night, Frank sat at the kitchen table surrounded by old photos, Lily kneeling in the dirt, grinning with dirt-smudged cheeks, their grandkids running barefoot along the fence line. One photo showed Lily coaxing a vine along the trellis she'd built herself. In each picture, the garden bloomed like a rebellion no one had noticed. He took out graph paper and a pencil. For the next hour, he sketched rectangles and circles, planters tucked along edges, a strip of marigolds near the driveway, creeping thyme under the mailbox. Small gardens, symbolic ones. Ones no gavel could reach. Just before dawn, Frank walked outside and eyed the strip of soil between sidewalk and street. He measured it with a glance, then took his spade and quietly cleared a 6x6 patch beside the mailbox. His hands moved with the calm deliberation of someone fixing a carburetor or sewing a torn sleeve. No need for noise. No speeches. By the time the sun broke the horizon, the soil was ready, turned and dark. Inside, the coffee machine hummed. Emily walked in later that morning, hair still damp from a quick shower. She grabbed the stack of mail on the table and flipped through until one envelope caught her eye. She frowned, slid it open, read the bold-faced text, and looked up slowly. "Grandpa, they sent you a cease and desist." The curb bloomed. Purple hyacinths, lemon thyme, and a hand-painted sign, "For Lily." Neighbors slowed their steps as they passed, some smiling, others merely pausing. The scent of fresh soil and thyme floated on the April air, mixing with sidewalk chalk and sun-warmed concrete. Frank knelt carefully, easing a small rosemary sprig into place beside the thyme. The sign stood proudly in the soil, letters uneven but lovingly painted. Across the street, Mrs. Dorsey walked her 2 grandchildren home from preschool. One of them tugged at her hand and pointed. "Nana, look! That one smells like lemon." The other crouched to trace a chalk heart onto the sidewalk, her yellow dress catching the wind. Frank gave them a soft nod, then wiped his hands on his jeans. Emily stood nearby with her phone in hand, not texting but documenting. She snapped a few photos of the curb, each angle capturing the way sun hit the lavender or how the hyacinths framed the old mailbox post. "Another email from the HOA," she said, scrolling. "They're threatening a larger fine now. Something about visual disruption of communal uniformity." Frank barely flinched. "Do they ever talk like people?" "Nope." She grinned. "But I'm keeping a record now. Everything." That afternoon, tucked behind the raised planter, Frank found the first note. A folded piece of paper, weighted down with a smooth river stone. In careful cursive, it read, "My mom loved daisies too. Thanks for reminding me of her." He held it for a long moment before tucking it into Lily's old garden journal. The leather-bound notebook, once faded and forgotten, had become his quiet compass. Each page, marked with sketches, seed names, little weather notes, Lily's voice living between the lines. He flipped to a section titled "Spring Borders" and traced the arc she had drawn, hyacinths in front, tall lavender behind. Frank smiled and picked up his trowel again. Later that week, as he trimmed stray shoots with kitchen scissors, a gray sedan rolled by slowly. Mr. Barnes sat behind the wheel, window down halfway. He stopped beside the curb, idled for a moment, then gave a small shake of his head, not in disapproval, but as though puzzling over something that no longer made sense. Then he drove on. The next day, Frank sat alone at the diner, sipping black coffee. June, the waitress with a crown of silver curls, approached with a newspaper clipping in hand. "Figured you'd want this," she said, sliding it beside his plate. It was from the local section. A single photo, Frank's curb flowers in full bloom. The caption read, "Guerrilla Garden or Local Gem? Residents weigh in." Frank chuckled under his breath and folded the page carefully. Just as he was tucking it into his jacket, a figure approached the booth. Mr. Barnes, cardigan and all, cleared his throat. "Mind if I join you?" Frank gestured to the seat. "Help yourself." They sat in silence for a few moments, the hum of the diner filling the space between them. Finally, Barnes spoke. "You always mow your own lawn." "Always did," Frank answered. "Even when Lily told me to hire someone." Barnes nodded. "I thought so. Your edges are always straight. Not many people still care about that." "She cared about that kind of thing," Frank said quietly. "Especially that last summer. We planted more than we should have. She said if she didn't have time, she'd steal it." Barnes stared into his coffee. "I remember her lavender. Smelled like home." Frank didn't answer, but he looked up, and Barnes saw something resolute there. At that week's HOA meeting, things ran as they always did, until the fine came up again. "Motion to approve updated enforcement actions regarding the unauthorized planting," Marlene intoned, tapping her pen. Barnes rose abruptly from his chair. "Excuse me," he said. "I've got a doctor's appointment." And he walked out before the vote. That night, Emily sorted mail at the kitchen counter. Bills, flyers, local events. She paused, holding one up silently. Frank turned from the sink, wiping his hands. "Grandpa," she said, handing it to him. The flyer was printed on plain paper, with a soft green border of ivy. Community Beautification Project, Volunteer Gardens Welcome. No signatures. No logos. Frank looked at it, then at Emily. Neither of them smiled. But the silence between them wasn't uncertain, it was expectant. On a warm Thursday morning in May, Frank awoke to find a note taped to his door, "They're watching. But we're planting too." The handwriting was neat, almost formal, and unsigned. He stood on the porch for a moment longer than usual, letting the birdsong wash over him. Across the street, Mrs. Dorsey knelt by her front steps, tucking marigold seedlings into the soil. A clay pot with bright pansies now sat beneath Mr. Harlan's window, and Miss Lopez had strung a hanging basket from her porch, morning glories already curling their way skyward. Frank touched the note again, then folded it into Lily's garden journal. At Maggie's griddle, the coffee cups clinked louder these days. Conversations spilled past the booths, most of them about plants, what thrived in shade, which seeds were still good, where the best compost came from. The little chalkboard by the register had a new scribble beside the day's breakfast special, "Sun's out. Dig something." June, sliding Frank his black coffee without asking, leaned close and said, "I'm seeing more smiles than I have in years. You'd think spring showed up early just for Willowbend." Frank sipped, slow and thoughtful. Maybe it did. Later that day, as he pushed the mower along the edges of his yard, Emily walked up with a stack of papers clutched under one arm. "I was thinking," she said, waving the top sheet. "Garden swap day. Everyone brings clippings, seeds, whatever they've got. No money, just exchange." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You organizing a revolution?" She grinned. "Nah. Just giving people something to do with those gloves they keep wearing on walks." By the following morning, small flower pots had begun appearing not just in front yards, but on mailboxes, porch railings, even curbside. One was a repurposed soup can filled with mint. Another was a cracked teapot overrun with violets. Marlene, passing by in her usual crisp pantsuit, slowed at Frank's mailbox and frowned. Her gaze flicked from the time to the little wind chime Emily had hung from the post. She muttered something inaudible and walked off stiffly. The next HOA meeting was more tense than usual. The agenda included unauthorized greenery and possible coordinated defiance. Marlene read each item in clipped syllables, her eyes flicking toward Barnes. Frank sat quietly at the back, next to Ms. Lopez, who nodded each time his name was mentioned. Mr. Barnes, looking slightly paler than normal, adjusted his glasses and said, "I know the bylaws. But if half the block's curb looks better than the HOA planters, what harm's a flower?" Marlene's pen tapped louder. "Precedent, Elwood. That's the harm." "Maybe the precedent we need," he said softly, but firmly. Murmurs stirred in the crowd. Mr. Harlan coughed to hide a chuckle. Mrs. Dorsey raised her hand and asked whether the HOA had ever surveyed residents on landscape preferences. The question hung unanswered. Back at Frank's, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a stack of fresh flyers. At the top, bold letters read, "Plant a memory, this Saturday." She held one up. Simple. No signatures. Just the idea. Frank nodded. Lily would have liked that. That evening, just as twilight turned the lawns a gentle blue and porch lights flickered on, Frank stepped outside with the last of his new planters. It was a simple wooden box he'd made himself, lined with plastic and filled with Lily's favorite mix of snapdragons and calendula. He placed it near the walkway, beside the curb where the original bulb had bloomed. He went inside for a cup of tea. By the time he returned, the air had cooled, and something felt off. The planter sat there, but the soil inside was pale and lifeless. Frank knelt, touched the top layer, and felt the sharp crunch of grains under his fingertips. Not dirt. Salt. A full bag, judging by the white clumps scattered through the roots. He sat back slowly, the cup still warm in his hand. Emily appeared behind him, lips parted, eyes narrowed at the mess. Frank didn't say anything at first. He looked at the flowers that wouldn't bloom and the note still tucked into his chest pocket. "They're watching," he whispered, almost to himself, "but so are we." Saturday arrived like a church bell, sunny, quiet, and full of anticipation. By 9, the grassy stretch near the library had already turned into a patchwork of color and chatter. Checkered picnic blankets lay flat beneath mason jars of cuttings. Old gardening gloves dangled from belt loops. A card table balanced between two lawn chairs bore a cardboard sign, free lemonade. One smile equals one cup. Frank stood beneath the shade of a sugar maple, a folding chair behind him and Lily's garden journal tucked under one arm. He watched as a retired couple unloaded a tray of iris bulbs wrapped in newspaper. A teenager with a skateboard leaned it against a park bench and began arranging tiny succulents in repurposed jelly jars. June arrived with a tray of scones and a knowing smile. "Told you folks would show," she said, adjusting her sun hat. "You bring the dirt, they bring the joy." Frank smiled faintly, nodding toward the growing crowd. "It's the first time I've seen Willowbend gather without someone calling a meeting." At the lemonade table, Evan, the freckled boy who once pointed at the curb bulb, held out a small plastic pot. Inside was a blooming marigold. "For Grandma Lily," he said. Frank took it gently, throat-catching. "She would have liked you." Across the street, the pale blue Buick sat in its usual spot. Its chrome trim caught the light like a quiet nod. Barnes hadn't spoken to Frank since the salted planter. But now the car was here, and its door opened slowly. He stepped out without ceremony, holding a manila folder tight in one hand. He didn't approach the booths or the scones. Instead, he wandered toward Emily, who was pinning the last flyer to a makeshift bulletin board nailed into a tree. "Miss Emily," he said, clearing his throat. She turned, wary but calm. "Morning." He handed her the folder. "Might want to give this a look." She opened it. Inside were several printed pages, HOA bylaws, dated and highlighted. "You're handing me rules?" she said, one eyebrow raised. Barnes glanced over at the families seated on blankets, the toddlers chasing each other across the grass. "I'm just saying, read section 12.3 carefully." He turned and walked back toward the Buick without waiting for thanks. Emily scanned the page, lips moving as she read. Her fingers stopped at a paragraph halfway down the second sheet. She read it again, then again slower. She hurried toward Frank, still clutching the marigold pot. "Grandpa," she said, section 12.3. "It says if a project gets 2/3 neighborhood support, the HOA can't issue fines related to that activity." Frank blinked. 2/3? She pointed to the crowd. "We count. No petition, no lawyer. Just presence." Frank turned, eyes moving slowly from the lemonade table to the man stringing paper lanterns between two posts, to the trio of elderly women passing clippings in a shoebox. Children giggled behind them, drawing vines and sidewalk chalk. June was laughing beside Mrs. Dorsey, a plate of scones in her lap. He did a quick count. Lawn chairs. Blankets. Kids tugging on pant legs. 31. Frank looked around. There were 31 people in the park. He whispered, "That's more than 2/3. Memorial Day arrived not with parades, but with petals and protest. The morning sun filtered through the branches of the willow tree, casting gentle shadows over the front lawn. Frank adjusted his straw hat and looked down at the patch of curb where Lily's rose had begun to bloom again. Nestled beside it, half-tucked under a stone, was a folded piece of paper, crayon colors bleeding slightly from dew. It was a child's drawing, a whole garden bursting with daisies, marigolds, and one large yellow rose in the center. Emily emerged from the house with a tray of lemonade and a stack of mismatched cups. "We've got about 30 minutes before folks arrive," she said, brushing grass from her jeans. "I set up the table near the mailbox." "Good," Frank said softly, sliding the drawing into Lily's garden journal. By noon, the yard had filled with quiet warmth. Folding chairs circled the old sundial. A picnic blanket sprawled across the lawn, topped with sandwiches, cookies, seed packets, and photos in weathered frames. One neighbor brought a rusted watering can, still painted with her father's name from 1944. She showed Frank a photo, sepia and curled, of a man kneeling beside a victory garden, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. "He planted cabbages before going overseas," she said. Said feeding the neighborhood was as important as fighting. Frank nodded, eyes lingering on the picture. That's the kind of thing Lily would have framed. People came with tulips in milk cartons, petunias in paper cups, and one single sunflower already stretching toward the sky. A soft murmur hummed through the gathering, stories of grandmothers, uncles, favorite backyard trees that shaded childhoods. June passed out lemon bars, chuckling as she dodged toddlers with juice boxes. Even the mailman stopped long enough to drop a daisy stem into a planter before tipping his cap. Then came the sharp click of heels. Marlene Wexler crossed the street with the precision of someone expecting silence. Her blouse was stiff, her lips tighter than usual. "This," she announced, waving her clipboard, "is an unapproved gathering. There are lawn permit codes and noise ordinances, and I see no application posted." The murmur died. Mr. Barnes, seated on the lowest step of Frank's porch, stood. He brushed biscuit crumbs from his khakis, adjusted his glasses, and faced her squarely. "You lost the vote, Marlene." She blinked. "Excuse me?" Barnes raised his voice just enough. Section 12.3. We counted heads. This event has more than 2/3 participation. That means you can't issue fines, cancel gatherings, or threaten residents without community consent. Marlene's nostrils flared. "This isn't over." No one responded. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single clap. It was Mrs. Dorsey, her hands still dusted with potting soil. One by one, others joined in, soft, steady claps that grew into something firm and clear. Marlene stood, clipboard quivering slightly, then turned on her heel and walked away, muttering about lawsuits and order. Barnes remained still for a moment, then faced the crowd. "In 10 days, I'm calling a special HOA vote," he said. "Motion to dissolve the current board. We'll decide, together, what this neighborhood grows into." Applause rippled again, this time louder. As the moment passed and the lawn settled into laughter and lemon bar crumbs, Frank poured 2 cups of lemonade, handing one to Emily. Across the street, a figure stood just beyond the sycamore tree, camera raised. She wore a green vest with a stitched logo, Willowbend Gazette. Emily nudged Frank. "Looks like someone's going to make the front page." He followed her gaze, then raised his cup slightly toward the reporter. "No speeches. No banners. Just petals, and the sound of one neighborhood remembering how to bloom." The Willowbend Community Hall had never been so full. Even the folding chairs from the church basement were brought in. The windows were cracked open to let in the warm June air, but the room still buzzed with the low hum of fans and human anticipation. Children's watercolor flowers lined the walls, some crooked, some smeared, all proudly signed in bold block letters. On the snack table, someone had brought peach cobbler, its scent rising above the rustle of papers and whispers. Frank adjusted Lily's gardening hat on his head. The brim had long since lost its shape, a soft fray framing his weathered face. He stood at the back of the room with Emily, who slipped her arm through his and whispered, "She would have loved this." Barnes cleared his throat at the front, tapping the microphone, which crackled in protest. "We'll begin," he said simply. Each resident moved forward in turn, secret ballots slipping into a repurposed cookie tin labeled HOA vote, motion number 14. The line curled around the room like a garden hose, slow, steady, familiar. Frank caught glimpses of faces, Mr. Harlan with his arm in a sling, Mrs. Dorsey in her gardening hat, and even young Evan standing beside his mother, holding her purse and watching solemnly. From her seat near the front, Marlene Wexler sat ramrod straight. Her blouse was immaculate, collar crisp, clipboard clasped like a shield. She had tried, in the minutes before the vote, to pass around a printed memo citing obscure Ohio statutes. Few had taken one. "I warn you," she said, voice slicing through the room, "this is not legally binding." Barnes didn't respond at first. He just waited for the last ballot to fall. Then he opened the tin and read. By count of 47 in favor, 12 opposed, he looked up, the room holding its breath. "The motion is passed. Effective immediately, Marlene Wexler is removed from her role as HOA president. Furthermore, we adopt the proposed amendment. Community votes will now determine future beautification policy." Silence. Then a sound, soft at first, like wind against a screen door. Applause. It spread from one corner, swelling gently until it filled the room, hands clapping with the weight of months, maybe years. Someone dropped a spoon on the floor. Another folding chair squeaked in protest as its occupant stood to clap harder. Marlene rose to speak, lips already pursed into protest, but a hand rose before her. Emily stepped forward, a sheet of paper held aloft. "This is the original HOA charter," she said. "Signed in 1979 by the founding residents. Including Lily Mayfield." She looked at Marlene, then to the crowd. "It says right here, all decisions, in spirit and in letter, shall serve the collective good of the community." Frank didn't speak at first. He simply stepped forward, nodding thanks as Barnes offered him the mic. The hall quieted again. "I don't know all the rules," Frank began, voice slow, gravel low. "But I do know what Lily believed. A neighborhood wasn't just lines and fences. It was people, and stories, and growing things, messy, sure, but good." He looked around, at the chalk flower murals, at the hands still faintly dirt-streaked, at the tin box of votes now holding more weight than anyone had guessed. This was always a place to grow. He handed the mic back. As the meeting wound down, clusters formed, neighbors exchanging phone numbers, promising clippings, passing around the last bites of cobbler. Frank found himself beside the snack table, sipping from a paper cup, Lily's hat tilted back. A man stepped forward, notebook in hand, camera slung at his hip. "Frank Mayfield?" he asked, already knowing. "I'm with the Willowbend Gazette. Mind if we run your story?" Frank looked past him, through the open doors, where the sky had turned a soft honey gold and the street shimmered with that late spring stillness. Somewhere, a sprinkler clicked to life. Petals caught the breeze. He smiled. "Depends," he said. "You got room for a rose?" 3 months later, the garden stretched across 5 front lawns, and every mailbox had flowers underneath. It was a golden August evening, the kind where shadows lengthen slowly and the sky takes its time turning from blue to copper. Wind chimes sang from porches, and the smell of potluck, rosemary rolls, pulled pork, fresh corn salad, floated over the block like a memory too good to fade. Children darted between picnic tables strung with lights, chasing fireflies in bare feet and stained t-shirts. A retired teacher named Harold leaned against the fence, coaxing soft tunes from an old harmonica, eyes closed, chin lifted toward the breeze. Emily walked beside Frank slowly, her hand tucked around his elbow. The crowd meandered like a slow river along the garden walk, neighbors and friends, a couple of curious visitors from the next town over. Every few feet, someone stopped to share a story, a grandfather who grew victory tomatoes in '44, a sister who had pressed daisies into every letter she ever mailed. The sundial near Frank's porch stood surrounded by blooms, yellow cosmos, red coneflowers, climbing morning glories that curled up the fence like ribbons. Just beside the stone was a small bronze plaque, recently fastened in the ground. It read, "Lily's garden, planted with memory, grown with love." Frank didn't speak when he saw it. He just took a long breath and felt the way his chest ached, but not in pain. Emily stepped forward and held out a package. "I thought maybe, this belongs to both of us now." It was Lily's journal. The old spiral spine had been replaced with hand-stitched leather, warm to the touch, still smelling faintly of pressed rose petals and ink. Between its pages were notes, diagrams, dried leaves, and tucked near the back, a folded clipping from the Willowbend Gazette. "The man who planted back a town." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "They make me sound like a hero." Mr. Barnes had joined them quietly, paper plate in hand. "You're just the guy who remembered what mattered." He nodded once and wandered off toward the peach preserves. The string lights blinked on as the sun finally dipped low, the first notes of laughter swelling over lawn chairs and gingham blankets. June had brought pie, blueberry and apple, and was already cutting slices with the precision of someone who'd done it for 100 church socials. Someone passed Frank a mug of coffee without asking. He drifted to the sundial again. It was quieter here, just out of the way. A breeze lifted his shirt collar and touched the edge of Lily's plaque. He rested a hand on the stone, calloused fingers brushing across the engraved letters. "We did it, Lily," he whispered. "Not all at once. But we did it." The fireflies came out in full then, flickering across the lawn like little stars someone had dropped too low. Behind him, the music rose, a harmonica weaving through conversation and clinking glasses, the thump of kids' feet on grass, the hum of summer joy. Frank turned and walked back toward the others. Someone waved him over. There was still pie to be had, after all. He smiled. And under the warm hum of string lights, beneath a sky both ancient and familiar, Frank Mayfield joined his neighbors, no longer alone, never again unwelcome, and let the evening hold him like a long-lost friend. The garden had begun as grief, and ended in gratitude. What started with one quiet act of planting became a chorus of color, proof that even the smallest resistance can bloom into something lasting. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble under their own weight. Maybe it's never too late to pull up the weeds of fear and sow something better with your neighbors. Like roots under shared soil, quiet courage has a way of holding us all together.